Hello, my name is Russell Fox. I teach political science at Friends University, which is a small Christian liberal arts school in Wichita, Kansas. I'm also a longtime member of the DSA, and I really appreciate the opportunity that religious socialism is giving me today to talk a little bit about what I believe are the important contributions that different religious movements in terms of building socialism can make to our efforts to construct socialism more broadly. Specifically, I want to talk about religious communalism. I'm going to share a PowerPoint real quickly, and I'm going to talk us through it. So, by religious communalism, I am talking about the movement by religious believers, and the ones that I am most familiar with are Christian, but obviously this is something that takes place in Muslim, in Hindu, in Jewish, and many other religious contexts. It is the desire of religious believers to build communities of equality, communities of justice, communities of holiness. Now, obviously, within different religious traditions, this has taken many, many different forms. I think exploring the commonalities and some things that we can learn from this communalist movement can help us as socialists to appreciate religious socialism better, as well as appreciate what our overall socialist project is. The artwork that you're looking at right now is a 19th century bit of, I guess you could call it proto-socialist realism. It comes out of Utah, and it comes from people who were part of what was called the United Order, the effort by a lot of early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that's the actual name of the Mormon Church, to build communities that would be sustainable, that would be equal, and that would build one another up towards their ultimate goal of establishing Zion, establishing God's kingdom here on earth. There's a lot of things that one could say against the Mormon tradition, both in past and in the future, but I want to focus on this communalist aspect, as well as the communalist aspect as it has been present in many other religious traditions as well. So really quickly, what do I mean by religious communalism? I am talking about, as I said, the impulse of religious believers to gather together in a community and make something that is righteous, make something that partakes of a degree of equality and environmental sustainability and simplicity. Different elements that you can find are the emphasis on separatism. We're going to build a commune. A degree of autarky. We're going to take care of ourselves. We're not going to be dependent upon others. A degree of communal ownership. We're all in this together. We're going to share our wealth with one another. We're going to support one another. A degree of lifestyle experimentation. Throughout history, you can find a lot of examples of religious communities that have taken this in some rather creative directions, talking about different varieties of sexual congress and different ways of thinking about relations between the genders. But even if you're looking at very traditional and even somewhat conservative communes, you will often see ways in which they depart from the dominant culture in regards to lifestyle. Maybe women are going to have a greater sense of responsibility, or maybe different jobs are going to be open to people that normally would be discouraged from taking on those tasks because they are coded for particular members of society. So that kind of experimental openness can be found in all sorts of religious communalist movements. The intentional focus, we are gathering together not because this is where we've chosen to move, because this is where we want to send our kids to school, or because there's a lake here or a beach here that I like, but we are gathered together for real intentional purposes of building something that is important to our faith. Some religious communalists are frankly utopian. They see themselves as modeling something for the rest of society. Others are really just intent on taking care of their own fellow believers, of creating something that is of significance to themselves. So All of these different elements of religious communalism can be found in all sorts of different experiments, both historically and presently. You have the Bruderhof, the Temple of the People. You have the Kibbutzim movement in Israel, the Hutterites, the Shakers, the Amish, the Mennonites. Coney Farm, which played such a large role in developing some of the language of the civil rights movement, Catholic worker houses, and the Catholic worker movement, which played such a large role in developing the language of labor unions in the United States. All of these, in different ways, partake of some of these different elements. Now, my own background, as I mentioned before, is Christian. And amongst Christians, there's a really explicit precedence for this. You take a look at the book of Acts, and you see the early members of what we could call the Jesus movement, the early followers of the gospel as it was laid out by Jesus Christ historically, gathering together. They are sharing their goods. They are eating together. They're living together. They're selling their goods and sharing amongst one another the proceeds. This kind of communalism, or this kind of communism, has been central to so many Christian movements throughout history. Obviously, it's never particularly been dominant. There are all sorts of ways in which the industrial capitalist world has subverted this rather pastoral vision. And yet the vision remains, motivating lots of different believers. And of course, there are plenty of people who have been motivated by these early stories of Christians living in community who themselves don't accept Christian principles or the Christian gospel. The message of living together, the message of sharing with one another, the message of treating everyone with respect, treating everyone as equals within a given community, that's a powerful vision. And you don't have to be a full believer in Christian theology to accept it. Obviously, many people have not. Now, amongst different communalists that have embraced this, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the Mormon tradition. There are, as I said at the beginning also, plenty of ways in which you could take a look at Mormonism or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and see them as a very Americanized, very conservative, very Republican entity that has no interest in any kind of socialist movement. And to be clear, throughout the 20th century, there were many leading members of the Mormon Church who basically denounced the church's 19th century history, insisted that those kind of communalist movements had nothing to do with socialist expectations or goals of egalitarianism, and interpreted them in very, very kind of pro-American, pro-private property ways. The thing is, of course, is that none of these efforts throughout the 20th century have changed the plain historical facts. The historical fact was that the United Order, even if they didn't consider themselves Marxist or socialist, they were working that same line. They were trying to build communities of equality and respect. They would pool their resources. They would work together. They would support one another. To quote the fifth president of the church, and I won't read this whole passage here, if we go about things in the American fashion, you would see an aristocracy growing up among us. You would have classes established here, some very poor and some very rich. Now, the Lord is not going to have anything of that kind. There has to be an equality, and we have to observe these principles that are designed to give everyone the privilege of gathering around him the comforts and conveniences of life. The idea that there will be no rich or poor, but rather you will build a place where all share in their wealth together, that all work together and respect one another in their work. That was the goal of what was called the United Order. These ideals are present in, as I said, so many different types of Christian communalists, and not just Christian communalists, but all sorts of religious communalist movements. The Bruderhof is a group of Christians that originated in the British Isles, mostly England, in the early 20th century. And they've embraced the idea of living together, of sharing their wealth with one another, of supporting one another through sustainable work. And they've spread throughout the British Isles, North America, both in the United States and in Canada, parts of South America as well. It's not a large group of people, but it is a group of people who are deeply devoted to the idea of exercising these kinds of what we can only call socialist principles through their faith. Uh, in an essay that was posted online by the Bruderhof community called "What Might Christian Socialism Look Like?" one devotee, one member of the community, quoted the British socialist William Morris. "It means creating a condition of society in which there should be neither rich nor poor, neither master nor master's man, neither idle nor overworked, neither brain-sick brain workers nor heart-sick hand workers. In a word, in which all men would be living in equality of condition and would manage their affairs unwastefully, with the full consciousness that harm to one would mean harm to all." This kind of communalist vision, this idea that we, since we hold to something higher and better than mere profit, are going to come together and share our resources and work with one another and live with one another and eat with one another and raise our children together in order to create a more equal society. That vision inspires so many in the past and today. Now, obviously, these sorts of societies are not describing the livelihood of most of the people on the planet Earth. Most people are not joining these kinds of communities. Most people are not willing to accept the limitations. Many people are bothered by the insularity of these communities. It's not a program for the whole world. So for socialists that really want to build a transformation of society broadly, what can we learn? Well, we have to be clear on what the advantages of the communalist approach and what the disadvantages of the communalist approach are. The benefits of the communalist approach is that it presents real models of more egalitarian forms of life. They are also, because they are sharing their goods, usually less involved in exploitive practices, much more concerned with the kind of productive work that can employ people and can supply the needs to keep the community satisfied, but not engage in some kind of rat race to increase their wealth. It, in so doing, creates a body of thought. It creates a form of teaching that other people can be inspired by and that other people can be attracted into the larger socialist movement by. Of course, at the same time, you have real particularity in these communities. One form of religious communalism is not going to accept other people from other traditions trying to build their own communalist movements. Some of them are going to be open to exploring different religious traditions, but others are not. So there's not a lot of experience within the communalist movement for negotiating pluralism, for learning how to deal with large degrees of diversity. And maybe most importantly, some people look at the communalist movement and they see a lot of effort for people to learn how to live socialist lives, a lot of effort on personal transformation so that you become more caring to one another, more attached to other people, more willing to share with other people, but not a real effort to reach beyond those people and start talking about social revolution. Now, in light of these advantages and disadvantages, I think it is fairly easy to connect with a long-standing argument amongst democratic socialists. What really is the way to build socialism if you have rejected the materialist argument that there is going to be an inevitable revolution? Well, as some scholars have put it, there is the horizontal strategy, which can be connected with the communalist strategy. The idea is to build socialism within small, partial, intentional communities. And these can be a beacon to the rest of the world. All sorts of different utopian movements have begun with these small, distinct communities. Robert Owen's, the Owenites, and their efforts to build egalitarian communities both in England and America is a good example. But there's also the vertical strategy. The idea that socialism is going to come a little bit at a time. It's going to come through the slow construction of the welfare state, through slowly introducing ways in which people throughout the entire society, throughout the whole nation, or maybe throughout the whole world, can adopt a few socialist principles in piecemeal fashion. This was the goal of the Fabian Society early in the labor and socialist movement in Great Britain. The idea was to find ways to introduce, in a parliamentary fashion, elements of socialist reform rather than trying to do it all at once on a small scale. These differences within the world of democratic socialism are part and parcel of our whole heritage. We see them enacted to this very day. You have all across the country chapters of Democratic Socialists of America, or different groupings of people, some of them religious, some of them not, talking about ways in which in their neighborhood associations and their small intentional communities, they can build socialist structures, local financing, public banks, things along those lines. And then, of course, you have the Bernie Sanders, you have the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes, people who on the highest level are trying to introduce certainly not socialism, certainly not fully egalitarian structures, but things like the Green New Deal or Joe Biden's recent Rescue America plan, which in their own ways are trying to introduce egalitarian efforts to help families, to help people, to build connections, and thereby treat people more as equals, economically speaking. Both of these examples in different ways partake of the democratic socialist ideal. Obviously, some people are going to be strongly committed to one over the other. Speaking of the communalist movement, some people within those movements are going to be very interested in the people on the vertical level trying to do things politically. And sometimes they're going to be very resistant to this. And the same thing happens on the other side. Sometimes people looking to move democratic socialism into the Democratic Party are going to be really supportive of the Quakers and the people from the Catholic worker houses and other folks that show up at the rallies. And other times they're going to look upon them critically. That criticism has to be kept in mind. There is always the reality that maybe socialism shouldn't be an ideal. Maybe socialism shouldn't be, as Rosa Luxemburg suggested, something that partakes of the utopian. It has to be rigorous, it has to be scientific, it has to be progressive in ways that push against the communalist vision. But let's not forget that there are people who think otherwise. And I'm going to finish this with reference to Murray Bookchin, one of the most important thinkers when it comes to libertarian socialism or municipalism, or as he often called it, the communalist movement. Communalism for him was not about religion. It was not something that was rooted in the Bruderhof or in the United Order or in kibbutzim or in any number of other devotional intentional communities. But the parallel is obviously there. If we can look at religious bodies coming together to live out their faith and build something egalitarian and build something sustainable and build something charitable and holy within themselves, well, then what you're seeing is the formation of communalism as a model that is not necessarily something that descends into anti-rationalism and anarchy. It's not necessarily something that's going to descend into authoritarianism through some kind of materialist vision of the world. It's something that's going to be open to all sorts of different spaces and structures, something that envisions a federation of communalists, a federation of socialist communities working together to emancipate the human race. This particular kind of vision, this religious communalist vision, is one that we have to respect. And I appreciate the people at Religious Socialism within the DSA asking to learn more about these different movements and how we can incorporate them into the larger project. They're an important part of it. They're an important part of the lives of many of us. They're an important part of my life as a religious believer. And I hope that whoever was watching this video will not only be open to the possibilities of those experimentations in your own life, but you'll be open to the ways in which they can benefit the socialist project overall. Thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate it.